There are places on Earth where the rules don't apply, where compasses spin, where time bends, where people walk into the trees and never walk out. The Appalachian Mountains are one of those places. And if you think you know this story, if you think this is just another tale about getting lost in the woods, you're wrong. Because what happens in the Appalachians isn't about getting lost. It's about being taken. And it's still happening. Before we start, watch this. This footage wasn't staged. It was recorded deep inside the Appalachian Mountains. No music. No filters. Just silence, and something moving where nothing should be. Listen carefully.
What is that? It's a snow! The fuck is it? Dude, no! It looks like a person, man.
The Appalachian Mountain Range stretches over 2,000 miles from Alabama to Canada, cutting through 13 states like a scar across the eastern United States. These mountains are old. Older than the Rockies. Older than the Alps. They've been standing for nearly 500 million years, worn down by time into something smooth and deceptive. They don't look dangerous. They look gentle, covered in thick forests that seem peaceful from a distance. But the people who live there, the ones whose families have been there for generations, they know better. They know the mountains have a memory. And they know that every year, people go in and don't come back. The indigenous tribes who lived in these mountains for thousands of years had rules. The Cherokee spoke of places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Areas where you didn't go alone. Where you didn't go at all, especially after dark. They warned of forests where sound moved wrong, where voices called to you in the language of people you loved, trying to lure you deeper. The elders taught their children that if you heard your name in the woods, you never answered. Because whatever was calling wasn't human, even if it sounded like your mother. Even if it sounded like your child crying for help. You turned around. You walked away. And you didn't look back. The settlers who came later dismissed these warnings as superstition. They went into the mountains anyway. Some of them never came out. And the disappearances have never stopped. The numbers are staggering. The National Park Service doesn't like to talk about it, but the data is there if you know where to look. Hundreds of people vanish in the Appalachians every year. Hikers. Hunters. Experienced outdoorsmen who know these trails better than their own neighborhoods. Families on vacation. Children playing near campgrounds. They step behind a tree to relieve themselves. They walk 30 feet ahead on the trail. They wander away from the picnic area for just a moment. And they're gone. Search and rescue teams are dispatched within hours. Dogs are brought in. Helicopters scan the canopy. Volunteers comb through miles of forest. And they find nothing. No tracks. No torn clothing caught on branches. No signs of struggle. It's as if the person simply ceased to exist the moment they entered the trees. But sometimes, they do find something. And what they find is worse than finding nothing at all. In 1973, a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin vanished in the Great Smoky Mountains. He was playing with other children near his family's campsite. His father looked away for less than a minute. When he looked back, Dennis was gone. The search that followed was one of the largest in park history. Hundreds of people. Weeks of searching. They never found him. But witnesses reported something strange. Multiple people claimed they saw a dark figure moving through the trees with something over its shoulder. Something the size of a small child. When investigators tried to follow the reports, they found nothing. No tracks. No trace. Dennis Martin was never seen again. In 2001, a woman named Jared Atadero disappeared in the Rocky Mountain segment of the Appalachian chain. He was 3 years old. His remains were found years later, miles from where he vanished, scattered across the forest floor. His clothes were gone. One of his shoes was found in a location that made no sense. There was no way a 3-year-old could have traveled that far on his own. And there was no explanation for how his remains ended up where they did. The official report called it an animal attack, but the forensic evidence didn't match. Something had moved that child miles through dense forest. And whatever it wasn't following any trail. Then there are the ones who come back. And sometimes, that's worse. A hiker in North Carolina disappeared for days in 2016. When search teams finally found him, he was sitting at the base of a tree, staring at nothing. He was alive, uninjured. But he wouldn't speak. Couldn't speak. He was catatonic, his eyes wide and glassy, like he'd seen something his mind couldn't process. When he was finally able to talk weeks later in a psychiatric facility, he said the same thing over and over. He said the trees were watching him. That they had faces. That something tall moved between them, following him, always staying just out of sight. He said it smiled at him. And when the doctors asked him to describe what he saw, he started screaming and didn't stop until they sedated him. He never went back to the mountains. He won't even look at photographs of forests. Rangers and local law enforcement have their own stories, the ones they don't put in official reports. They talk about finding clothing neatly folded on trails, arranged in ways that suggest the person undressed themselves calmly and deliberately before walking deeper into the forest. Boots lined up perfectly. Jackets folded. But the people are never found. Locals talk about hearing voices in the woods, voices that sound exactly like their friends or family members, calling for help from places no one should be. Experienced hunters talk about sudden silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Where every bird stops singing at once. Where insects go quiet. Where even the wind seems to hold its breath. That's when they know to leave. Because the silence means something else has arrived. Something that makes every living thing in the forest hide. There are patterns in the disappearances that investigators can't explain. People vanish near bodies of water. Near boulder fields. In areas where the terrain suddenly changes. Children are found miles away, up steep inclines they couldn't have possibly climbed, in terrain that would have exhausted an adult. People are found without their shoes, even in winter, even in freezing temperatures, with no explanation for why they would remove them. Time distortion is reported by survivors over and over again. They believe they've been gone for hours, but days have passed. They have no memory of where they were or how they survived. Some are found with injuries that suggest they fell from great heights, but they're discovered in flat areas. Others have no injuries at all, despite being missing for days without food or water in harsh conditions. The evidence doesn't add up. It never adds up. The phenomenon of hearing voices is reported so frequently that local search and rescue teams have started including it in their training. They warn volunteers that if they hear someone calling for help in the forest, they need to stop and assess. Because the mountains have a way of using your own mind against you. A volunteer in Tennessee reported hearing a child crying during a search operation. The sound was moving. Always just ahead. Always just out of sight. He followed it for 20 minutes before his radio crackled and his team leader asked where he was going. He'd walked nearly a mile off course, moving deeper into an area the team had specifically avoided. An area where 3 people had vanished the year before. When he stopped and listened carefully, he realized the crying wasn't moving away from him. It was circling back. It was leading him somewhere. He turned around and ran. There are stories of shadow figures seen between the trees. Tall shapes that don't move like people. Park visitors report seeing something standing in the forest, watching them, but when they look directly at it, it's not quite there. It's behind a tree. It's in their peripheral vision. But it won't stay in focus. Hunters with decades of experience talk about encounters with something they refuse to fully describe. They say it was tall, thin, that it moved wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't, that it made sounds that resembled human speech but weren't quite words, that when it looked at them, they felt something ancient and hungry looking back. These are not people prone to fear. These are individuals who spend weeks alone in the wilderness. But they won't go back to certain areas. They won't even tell you where those areas are, because they don't want anyone else going there either. The theory that the mountains themselves are somehow aware, somehow conscious, sounds insane until you hear it from enough people. Park rangers with 20 years of experience will tell you, off the record, that there are parts of the forest that feel wrong, where GPS devices malfunction, where animals refuse to go, where, even in the middle of summer, the temperature drops suddenly and your breath fogs in the air. They'll tell you about trails that seem to change, paths that were there yesterday but aren't today, landmarks that move, and they'll tell you the rules. Don't hike alone. Don't leave the trail. Don't go into the forest after sunset. And if you hear your name, if you hear someone you love calling to you from the trees, you run. You run and you don't stop. Until you're in your car with the doors locked and you're driving away. Because whatever is calling you isn't what you think it is. And if you go to it, you will disappear. After dark, the mountains change completely. People who've camped in the Appalachians talk about nights when the darkness feels solid. When you can shine a flashlight into the trees and the beam just stops, like it's hitting a wall. When you hear footsteps circling your tent but nothing shows up in the beam when you look. When you hear breathing that's too loud, too slow, too close. Rangers rotate shifts and refuse to patrol certain areas alone after sunset. They've found too many abandoned campsites with fires still burning, food still on plates, tents still zipped from the inside, and absolutely no sign of the people who were there. As if they simply vanished mid-meal. As if something came and took them so quickly they didn't have time to scream. The most disturbing cases are the ones where people are found alive, wandering miles from where they disappeared, with no memory of how they got there. Found sitting calmly in places they shouldn't be able to reach. Found with expressions of pure terror frozen on their faces. A woman was discovered in 2018 after being missing for 6 days. She was sitting in a tree, 30 feet up, in the middle of winter. When search teams got her down, she kept saying that she climbed up to hide. That something was below her. That it waited. When they asked her to describe it, she said it looked like a man from far away. But up close, the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long. The face was too smooth. And the eyes didn't blink. She said, it stood at the base of the tree for hours, looking up at her, smiling. Just standing there. Smiling. Until the sun came up and it walked back into the forest. The Appalachian Mountains have been here for 500 million years. They've watched species rise and fall. They've seen civilizations come and go. And deep in those forests, in places where humans rarely venture, there are things that have been there just as long. Things that know the trails better than any map. Things that understand how to move through the trees without making a sound. Things that have learned how to mimic voices, how to lure, how to hunt. The indigenous tribes knew. The early settlers learned. And every year, more people learn too late. Because the mountains are patient. They don't need to take everyone. Just enough. Just the ones who wander too far. Just the ones who don't listen to the warnings. Just the ones who think they're safe. Last year, 43 people vanished in the Appalachian region. 27 were never found. Of the 16 who were recovered, 11 were found dead with no clear cause. 5 were found alive. None of them will talk about what happened. 1 is still in psychiatric care. 2 moved across the country and refused to go near any forest. The other 2 simply say they don't remember. But their families report that they wake up screaming. That they stare out windows at night like they're watching for something. That they flinch at the sound of birds. And that sometimes, late at night, they whisper the same thing. They whisper that it's still calling them. That they can still hear their names in the wind. That something in the mountains knows they got away. And it wants them back. Right now, as you listen to this, someone is hiking in the Appalachian Mountains. They're following a trail. They're taking pictures. They're enjoying the peace and quiet. And somewhere in those ancient trees, something is watching them. Something is waiting for them to step off the path. To walk just a little too far from their group. To ignore that feeling in their gut that says they should turn back. Because the mountains are always hungry. They've been feeding for longer than we've been counting. And they're not done yet. Not even close. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves creepy stories, and don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon, because this is just the beginning. The next story might be darker, and you won't want to miss it.